Anatomy of the alimentary canal. Okay, so there are many organs which are present in the alimentary canal, and we will start off with the esophagus. So what is an esophagus? The esophagus is a fibromuscular tube of 25 centimeter in length. That is the total length of the esophagus. This is a rough diagram that I have drawn of an esophagus. Okay, so the total length of this esophagus starting from the pharynx up to the stomach is 25 centimeter in length. Okay, and what is the main function of the esophagus? The main function of the esophagus is transport of food from the pharynx up to the stomach. Whenever we ingest a food, it passes through the pharynx, then to the esophagus, and then to the stomach. So the main function of esophagus is transport of food from pharynx up to the stomach. The esophagus originates at the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage at C6 cervical vertebra and extends to the cardiac orifice of the stomach at the 11th thoracic vertebra. This is the pharynx from where the esophagus starts, and this is the cardiac orifice of the stomach. Cardiac orifice of the stomach. This cardiac orifice is this part, and it is at the level of the 11th thoracic vertebra. If we look at this diagram, we will be able to see the cricoid cartilage. This butterfly shaped cartilage is the thyroid cartilage. This is the cricoid cartilage. Just below the thyroid cartilage is the cricoid cartilage, and above the thyroid cartilage is the hyoid bone. Okay, so the cricoid cartilage is present at the level of 6 cervical vertebra, and from here the esophagus is starting, and this part is the trachea. The esophagus is present just behind the trachea. Okay, just behind the trachea is present the esophagus. If we look at this another diagram, this is a rough diagram of the cervical of the spinal cord. Okay, so these are the parts I have drawn. This is the cervical part and this is the thoracic part. Okay, so from the 6th cervical vertebra the esophagus is beginning, which is at the level of the cricoid cartilage, and it ends into the stomach at the 11th thoracic vertebra, which is the cardiac orifice of the stomach. This part. The anatomical course of the esophagus. It descends down from the cricoid cartilage. It descends down from the cricoid cartilage, enters the stomach at T11, means it enters the stomach at the 11th thoracic vertebra, that is T11th. Okay, it enters the abdomen, piercing the diaphragm. The diaphragm is placed a little above the stomach. Okay, just one vertebra above the stomach at the level of T10. At the level of T10, the esophagus pierces the diaphragm and enters into the total abdominal region. Okay, at the level of T10. Layers of the esophagus. Okay, if we take a cross section of the esophagus, we will see that there are various layers of the esophagus. Okay, the esophagus has 4 layers. So what are the 4 layers? They are the adventitia layer. Okay, this is the adventitia layer and this is the outer layer of connective tissue. See, if we take a close look of these cross sections, this outer portion which is in white is the adventitia layer. This outer portion is the adventitia layer, and the next layer is the muscle layer. Okay, this is the muscle layer which is shaded in the blue. This muscle layer has 2 types of layers. Okay, the external layer and the internal layer. Okay, the external muscle layer have different types of muscles which depends on the parts of the esophagus. Means the upper part has a different layer, the middle part has a different muscle layer, and the lower part have a different external muscle layer. Okay, if we go through the superior layer, the superior layer have only voluntary striated muscle. The external muscle layer in the superior part consists of voluntary striated muscle. The middle third of the external muscle layer, this middle third consists of both voluntary striated muscles as well as the smooth muscles. And the lower third of the external layer, lower third of the external layer consists of only smooth muscles. Okay, And then we comes to the internal layer. The internal layer of the esophagus consists of circular muscle. This muscle remains same throughout the length of the esophagus. Okay, from the pharynx up to the stomach, the circular muscle is present in the internal layer, contains only the circular muscle and no other muscles. This is the submucous layer. This part which is shaded in the red is the submucous layer. Okay, is the submucous layer, and the part which is in white is the mucus layer. This is a very important layer. This mucus layer is very important. Now comes the mucus layer. The mucus layer consists of non-keratinized squamous epithelial cells. Okay, and it merges with the columnar epithelium of the stomach. This means that the esophagus consists of squamous cells, and it merges with the columnar epithelium of the stomach. Okay, the stomach has columnar epithelium cells and the esophagus has squamous epithelium cells. Okay, at this junction where they two meet, the squamous epithelium of the esophagus meets with the columnar epithelium of the stomach. It's called squamocolumnar junction. Now the food passes through the rhythmic contraction of the muscle layer called peristalsis. Okay, when we ingest a food, it passes from the pharynx to the esophagus and then to the stomach through a series of wave-like motion. Okay, the esophagus contracts like a wave. Okay, this movement is called peristalsis, and this movement is completely dependent on this muscle layer. This muscle layer of the esophagus is completely responsible for peristalsis to happen, and hardening of this muscle layer interferes with peristalsis and difficulty in swallowing called dysphagia. If due to some reasons the muscle layer gets hardened or loses its elasticity, then what will happen? It will interfere with the elasticity and interfere with the peristalsis, and the patient will find difficulty in swallowing, which is called dysphagia. Dysphagia means difficulty in swallowing food. Now our next topic is the esophageal sphincters. Okay, the esophagus has two sphincters. One is the upper sphincter and the other one is the lower sphincter. What are sphincter? These are narrow constrictions. These are narrow constriction zones. Okay, which have some protective and preventive functions. The upper sphincter is present between the pharynx and the esophagus. Okay, this somewhere close to this part. Okay, the upper sphincter is placed somewhere in this part. So the upper esophageal sphincter is made up of cricopharyngeus muscle. Okay, the upper sphincter is made up of a cricopharyngeus muscle, and the cricopharyngeus muscle main function is to, it prevents the air entrance into the esophagus. Okay, it prevents the entry of air into the esophagus. Okay, and the lower esophageal sphincter is present at the gastroesophageal junction. The gastroesophageal junction, the gastro means the stomach and the esophagus is this part. Okay, so and this junction is called the gastroesophageal junction, and this junction is at the level of T11th vertebra. Okay, this is the point where the lower sphincter is present. During peristalsis the sphincter is relaxed. During peristalsis the sphincter is relaxed and allows the food to enter the stomach. Okay, when we ingest something, okay, when the food is coming down, the sphincter relaxes and allows them to pass to the stomach, and at rest they remain contracted. Why they remain contracted? At rest they remain contracted. Why they remain contracted? So that they prevent the reflux of gastric content into the esophagus. Okay, they prevent the backflow of the food that we have eaten into the esophagus. Okay, so as it is a fibromuscular structure, it will have blood supply and venous drainage as well as nerve supply. Now we will go through them. The blood supply is, the esophagus has two parts, the thoracic part, which is a major part of the esophagus, and the abdominal part, which is present just below the abdomen, the diaphragm, sorry. Okay, the thoracic part receives blood from the thoracic aorta and the inferior thyroid artery. let's take a view on this picture. Okay, so these are both the lungs. Okay, these are the lungs. This one is the esophagus. Okay, this is the thoracic aorta, and this is the inferior thyroid artery, and here thyroid gland is usually present. Okay, I'm not drawing the thyroid gland, but this thoracic aorta and the inferior thyroid artery are the major blood supply to the thoracic part of the esophagus, and the venous drainage is through the azygos vein. Okay, this is the azygos vein drawn in blue. This is the venous drainage, means it carries the deoxygenated blood from the esophagus. And the abdominal part receives blood from the left gastric artery. Okay, this part, the abdominal part, which is present just below the diaphragm, receives blood supply from the left gastric artery and the left phrenic artery. We will see these arteries when we will go through the stomach section. Okay, and it drains via the left gastric vein and the azygos vein. The main venous drainage of the esophagus is through the azygos vein. Okay. Acha. Now the nerve supply of the esophagus. Okay, the esophagus has both parasympathetic nerve supply as well as sympathetic nerve supply. The parasympathetic nerve supply is from the vagal trunk, and the sympathetic nerve supply is from the cervical and the thoracic trunk. The cervical trunk and the thoracic trunk. Okay, the upper sphincter, the upper sphincter and the lower sphincter receives the nerve supply from the nucleus ambiguous, and the lower sphincter receive supply from the dorsal motor nucleus. Okay, this lower sphincter receives nerve supply from the dorsal motor nucleus, and the upper sphincter receive nerve supply from the nucleus ambiguous, and both this nucleus ambiguous and the dorsal motor nucleus both are part of the vagal trunk. Okay, now comes the lymphatic drainage. The lymphatic drainage completely depends upon the parts, that is parts of the esophagus which they are draining. Means the superior part, that is the cervical portion. Okay, drains into the deep cervical lymph node. This middle portion, which is present in the mediastinum, okay, is draining through the superior and the posterior mediastinal nodes, and the lower third of the esophagus, which is just below the diaphragm, is drained by the left gastric and the celiac nodes. So this is all about esophagus. Stay tuned, and the stomach anatomy will be coming soon.